with Trump's inauguration and now him becoming the president. The day of the inauguration, he went to the White House and he did I think it was like a press conference while he was signing the laws, or sorry, signing the executive actions. He was just asking, okay, which is this one? Signing, answering questions, and sort of going there. There were a few. It was sort of like an interesting sort of way it was conducted. He signed like few dozen executive orders on pretty much day one, as well as repealing, I think, like the dozens more from the past. And I think few of them have been a bit more controversial, some a bit less, some a bit better, some a bit worse, and some uh, potentially even scary, depending on how it goes. He did some other actions that I also want to discuss, um, which basically sort of the core of this episode is sort of like what is really the purpose of executive orders and how it should be handled, and when can we sort of say like this is going too far. Like, yes, a president by the constitution has granted powers, executive powers, even when it comes to issuing executive orders, as well as can be granted more powers by Congress itself when they pretty much give him the power to do more things. And to discuss this is joining me James Valliant, who's a lawyer, who also does the Constitution course on ARCUK. So if people are interested in more of this stuff, they can become members and learn more. Uh, but James, I want to go to the executive orders a bit later because first I want to discuss one of the actions that was done. So, and it's specifically the TikTok ban. So, Trump was actually the one who was pushing the TikTok ban back in, I think it started around 2019, maybe even around that time. Then, during the Biden administration, we actually got a bill passed through the Congress, which had large amount of support, I believe even bipartisan. It was signed into law by Biden, and something I was really surprised, also affirmed in the Supreme Court 9-0. So no, pretty much no room for, or at least not saying it's like a good or bad thing, but basically it's according, at least for them, it's in accordance to the Constitution. Basically, doesn't go against the Constitution. And then I think before even Trump got inaugurated, he said he will do something to bring TikTok back. And TikTok itself was only banned, or sort of was only down in the US for I think about a day, and then it was brought back with the message saying something like, "Thanks to the efforts of Donald Trump, we are able to be back." Now, James, what did you think about this action? First, sort of like where can even Trump go with this? Because even when it comes to sort of executive powers of presidents, they don't take precedence before the Congress, and they definitely don't take precedence before the Supreme Court. So, what do you make of this action? How can I was surprised that it was back. I was thinking like, how can something like this even happen?
Well, the law itself, the law that was upheld by the Supreme Court, and we can question whether or not it is a violation of the First Amendment or exceeding the power of Congress to do so. But the Supreme Court, as you pointed out, unanimously upheld it. And so it's the law of the land. And by the terms of that statute, a president can delay the enactment of the ban, but only if there are concrete, specific deals in the works. So there had to have been contracts signed, commitments made. We're in the middle of it, and it just needs a little more time to work itself out. And although there have been businessmen, Elon Musk, that guy from Shark Tank, they say we've got deals in that we would offer, but that's not sufficient under the law. So he exceeded his authority under the law, in my view. Now, that'll take time to test, of course. If you're an enemy of TikTok, you've got to press that back and say, I'm somehow harmed, go to federal court and fight it that way. But that'll take time. And in the meantime, Trump is buying himself time, buying TikTok time. It is ironic that he was a supporter of it. That was passed with bipartisan support. And now he's changed his mind. And of course, it wasn't a principled free speech stance ever on Trump's part, whether he was for it or against it. He said they were good to me, which is always disturbing when Trump says that. Since I succeeded by using TikTok in the campaign, I've grown friendly to TikTok because they were good to me, which is really interesting. It's not like he's taking a principled stance on behalf of free speech or against economic regulation or something. But I was not surprised by the Supreme Court, what was being challenged here. And it goes to the wider point of economic regulations. What was being challenged here was foreign ownership. And the other thing is that it invoked national security interests because it's Chinese foreign ownership. And not a question of what the platform can say or how it allows speech or non-speech. And so I think it's, while I disagree with the current First Amendment jurisprudence of the Supreme Court, it was very much within the bounds of current First Amendment free speech law, unfortunately. But the ban was upheld against TikTok. I would rather them not have had the ban and approach the problem of China in a more direct way, rather than, it's like with tariffs. Tariffs against China. Well, okay, you're after China. Why are we trading with China at all? Why do we have diplomatic relations with China at all? If they are a national security threat, there are much more fundamental ways in which we can go after it, as opposed to harming people, ordinary business people, or restricting the free speech of Americans on TikTok. So I do think it invoked things in the Constitution that were more of a concern to me than the Supreme Court. But as I say, that's current Supreme Court law. On the other hand, there's no question in my mind Trump violated the terms of the law, which has been upheld by the Supreme Court, and exceeded his authority, certainly exceeded his authority in granting this suspension of the effect of the law. But the suspension, even if he's overruled on that suspension, which I suspect he might be, should there come a case where he's tested on it, he would still grant TikTok this time to create a deal, to move around the law and create something where there's domestic ownership, or at least non-Chinese ownership.
Yeah, I think he was toying around with the idea of potentially directly U.S. ownership, meaning directly
Yeah,
the government owning it.
he thinks we should get 50%. The U.S. should get. See, I don't like government owning private businesses either. But then again, government has been part of private businesses. I mean, from the Tennessee Valley Authority to all kinds of nationalized railroads, you name it, having a national bank, the Federal Reserve, in effect. All of that I regard as a corruption of our constitutional system. But on the other hand, that's Mr. Trump, isn't it? It's not unprecedented for the government to be involved, but I don't want the government involved in any media corporation, whatever. Even subsidies to public television I regard as pernicious and violations of the First Amendment in a variety of ways. But that would be a long discussion.
Yeah, I mean, people oftentimes say, even when it comes to things like tariffs or even potentially this TikTok ban, they always say, well, Trump is a negotiator. He wants to get a better deal. Or when it comes to, when he threatened Canada, Greenland, and Panama, sort of like, well, he's not actually going to invade. He's just using it as a negotiation tactic. And oftentimes, I could see the case, especially when it comes to NATO. A lot of countries are indeed. I think my country has actually caught up Slovakia, so I'm not a target of this. But he's made a case that some are not fulfilling their obligations, and while I could see that, I think there is like a proper way of going about it. Basically, saying something like, "Hey, you guys are not fulfilling your obligations. We'll have to leave NATO if you guys do not
Right.
fulfill." I think that's much better way of properly addressing it than "we'll invade you" or sort of like
Well,
doing like
not
even
put it
this.
taking it up. Well, see, words are not to be taken. It's hard to judge from his words because for Trump, words are not conceptual identifications of some fact of reality. No, so some actual class in reality. For him, words are negotiating tactics. And so whatever comes out of Mr. Trump's mouth, very frequently you can't take seriously. You have to take with a grain of salt, because it's precisely that. It's a negotiating tactic. So his words are a negotiating tactic. Now, in theory, I'm not opposed to American expansion. In theory, if someone, if America has a great system and it expanded, and built into the Constitution is the idea that states can be added to the Union. So the framers did anticipate the expansion of the United States, and I have no problem theoretically. Now, I don't want Canada in the United States. That would be politically bad. And I do not like threats made. When he says we will not take military force off the table when it comes to Greenland and Canada, that is absolutely awful. I think the Panama Canal is a special case, but that would derail us here. On the other hand,
Yeah.
threats of force are just wrong coming from the president. Even if it is just a negotiating tactic, he shouldn't be threatening our allies with force. Canada, Greenland, Denmark are being threatened with force. That is just wrong.
Yeah.
Um,
Now,
he's a
going back,
bully.
yeah, going back to the executive orders because we're like halfway in, we barely
Oh,
covered them.
yeah, we don't
So
have
for
time. There's so
yeah,
many executive orders. There's no way we can cover them
Uh,
all.
so first, someone says the best executive order would be all previous executive orders are hereby null and void. And I think Trump did revoke some executive order that was done by Lyndon B. Johnson. And in some ways, I could understand the sentiment. Like in a similar way, it's not the job of president to legislate. If there is something that's sort of in the books for like 50 years, guys, get it through Congress and like make it actual law. Don't have it be like an executive order that can be done away with just by
Well, we live in a very corrupt state. The administrative state, the regulatory state, has taken over. Since the 1930s, the Supreme Court has said that the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, in effect, makes Congress an economic dictator. Now, in recent decades, there has been a small, tiny pullback from this economic omnipotence that the Supreme Court says the Commerce Clause gives Congress. But that has caused all kinds of regulatory and administrative agencies to come into existence. And that has posed a constitutional problem because these administrative agencies combine both the legislative as well as the executive as well as the judicial functions all in one agency, which is a clear violation in my mind of the original separation of powers that was intended by the framers of the Constitution and James Madison. But from the 1950s forward, the Supreme Court has been finding all kinds of complex ways to justify that violation of the basic constitutional order of America. So something like the Environmental Protection Agency has the power to make the rule, interpret the rule, and enforce the rule, which is just a gross violation of the Constitution on the face of it. And so what's happened, Congress has given so much of its rulemaking authority to these agencies that the president has executive control over. Now, to some extent, they have limited the authority or created an independence on the part of this economic regulatory agency, so the president can't fully control and set the tone. But the fact that we are living in a rule of executive orders, and that they've been increasing with each new president issuing a larger and larger number of executive orders, shows us how powerful the administrative state has become and how spinelessly Congress has yielded its legislative authority over to the executive branch, so that each time there's a new party who takes over the White House, there's a wave of regulation changes, executive orders, and so we live in the rule by executive order, which is in itself a corruption. I was complaining when Obama was doing it. Remember, Obama said, "I can skip the Congress. I can do it with a phone and a pen." Well, that in essence, when Obama said that, long before Trump, I can do it by a pen and a phone because I've got the executive order power. That in itself is a statement of the constitutional corruption that America has been living under my whole lifetime, and with only modest pullbacks from the Supreme Court in recent years. But they have been pulling it back somewhat. But you're absolutely right. It's the rule by administrative agencies that is in itself so corrupt. It's the very fact that a change in the who's in the White House can change, in effect, important law in the United States is a violation, in my mind, of the Constitution itself. That's not the way the framers meant laws to be made, laws to be interpreted, or laws to be enforced. And so that's really the fundamental problem. We need to eliminate this regulatory administrative state altogether. And the Supreme Court, since the 1950s, though, has in effect allowed it to happen. And so made our presidents emperors, of super strong presidents, because to the extent, and there's going to be all kinds of challenges on this, such as birthright citizenship, for example. There, I think when the president says no birthright citizenship, he's definitely wanting the Supreme Court to test the matter. There's
Yeah.
only
Well,
very little Supreme Court legislation or Supreme Court decisions on this. The immigration itself is not within the power of Congress explicitly. Sort of the Supreme Court is granted just because a sovereign state has the power to regulate immigration. But Congress is nowhere given the power to control immigration under the Constitution. I think we should be able to keep out physical dangers, threats, but that's not the line they draw, and it's not in the Constitution at all. Now, when the 14th Amendment was passed to ensure that freed black slaves would be states, the 14th Amendment states that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Now, subject to the jurisdiction was early on understood to mean not the children of ambassadors or foreign officials or foreign sovereigns visiting the country. And if you were on and the whole visa system, in my view, is corrupt in America. It's Byzantine and its ridiculous unfairness. But in any case, if you're on, say, a temporary visa and you have a child here, those kind of situations, in the wake of the passage of the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court was busy scratching out its provisions, saying that separate but equal, Jim Crow, was constitutional in Plessy versus Ferguson, that the Privileges and Immunities Clause didn't mean what it said. And so we've had to rely on the Due Process Clause. But even in the midst of all that Supreme Court corruption, there was a Supreme Court case that said birthright citizenship is for real. The child of Chinese immigrants, even after the Chinese Exclusion Act, America's first horrific foray into having immigration laws, is to exclude Chinese and to make it very difficult for them to become citizens. Nonetheless, the Supreme Court, in a case from 1898, said, no, that Chinese kid is a U.S. citizen. He was born here. His parents didn't have any they weren't subject to the authority of the Emperor of China anymore, and therefore that kid is a U.S. citizen. And that's a great case. But that's the case that as I say, it's 127 years old now. So that's the case that would have to be overturned, it seems to me, for Trump to get what he wants. Birthright citizenship is built into the U.S. Constitution. And I think in doing that, he knows there's going to be a challenge and wants Supreme Court law on it so that he can take the next step, a constitutional amendment, a statute by Congress, whatever the Supreme Court will say about that.
yeah, I want to definitely continue on that, but I want to bring in just a few more things before. So first, just to mention to people, because big amount of executive orders were done on the first day, but actually, I think yesterday or today, Trump designated Ansar Allah as foreign terrorist organization. For those who don't know, Ansar Allah is the Houthis, and I was surprised it wasn't designated, but I believe there's like a separate designation that they already had, but they didn't have one. Basically, the way it went is like Trump designated it first in 2019 or when he was president, then Biden took those designations away, claiming, there is a crisis in Yemen, we have to help them. Then he redesignated them after October 7, or basically when they started bombing international shipping. But there was still like one designation they didn't have, and Trump reinstated this. So I just wanted to mention, I think this
Anything that can
absolutely
be
makes
done
sense.
by an executive order mostly can be undone by an executive order. If Biden ordered one thing, Trump can undo that order. And insofar as there are people who may be directly affected and have a due process right, he can't change that. But otherwise, the president can largely undo whatever the previous president did by executive order with a new executive order.
Now,
That's part of the arbitrariness, I think, of the administrative and regulatory state, too. I mean, the law itself changes so dramatically when a new party takes the White House. That wasn't the vision of the framers,
now
nor
I just
really
want to
fair.
Yeah, I want to mention this because you mentioned it to me that he declared the national energy emergency, which I'm wondering how much of a difference this makes in America, because in Slovakia there is like an actual legal thing called a national emergency. What it allows, one of the things it allows Parliament to pass laws faster, meaning it doesn't have to go through like second and third reading. It can just quickly pass through. This was used during the COVID when a large amount of stuff had to happen immediately, and they in a sense couldn't, I don't want to say couldn't have been bothered through going through the full process, but sort of because of an emergency had to take faster actions. So when it comes to in Slovakia national emergency, it's like an actual thing that gives a lot more power to either the prime minister or thing. And I'm wondering because
Recall what I said.
is it just sort of like a symbolic thing, or is it like an actual thing? Like this means that they'll get more powers, and if
Oh,
so, who and what?
he's declared two national emergencies this week, one on immigration and the border, two on energy. And what that does is it does give the president, and remember what I said about regulatory agencies having independent authority. It allows him to cut through the independence of their authority. It allows him a more efficient path to order them to follow his policy. Now, to a certain extent, executive discretion is built into the situation. Let me give you a simple example. There's a law against littering, there's a law against armed robbery. A cop is on the beat and he's walking down the street. On one hand, he sees a person littering in the park. On the other hand, he sees an armed robbery in progress. He has the discretion to go with the more serious one and ignore the littering case so he can catch the armed robber. And in fact, that kind of discretion is sort of inherent in the enforcement of any law. But that should be a very, very narrow band within the meaning of the law passed by Congress. And that's exactly what we've gotten passed. The executive discretion when you declare an emergency now widens. So the president can say, oh, forget about that regulation. Oh, don't do that. He issued, for example, a 60-day moratorium on the issuing of any new regulations. And any recently proposed regulation from Biden, it's on hold. Freeze that until we can review the new regulation. Government hiring freeze any new hiring by the federal government until we can figure out how we're going to reform civil service, because they'll have to do that through an act of Congress, he knows. But in declaring an energy emergency, what's the energy emergency and how do you define it? And he just says it's an emergency. That will be tested in court, because it does increase the president's power to bypass, to cut through the regulatory red tape and the ordinary procedures that would be required to enact a regulation by the regulatory agency. What the Strategic Petroleum Reserve has now been depleted, and so we're in an emergency. I don't know how he's going to do that, but he claims that there's this emergency, and that increases his executive power over what would otherwise be independent agencies that have a very strict and drawn out protocol for how to make a regulation within their own agency, if
Now,
that makes.
yeah, I think it makes sense for the people. Now, I want to quickly jump to something that wasn't really that much discussed in the media, or at least I haven't seen, and it's the executive order restoring the death penalty and protecting public safety, which I'm wondering if you read through it. And one of the aspects that was the most interesting to me is so I think the in section 1 it says he orders his attorney general to pursue death penalty in cases where it's possible, or basically whenever it's possible, as well as one of, I think in section 5, it says sort of challenge the Supreme Court precedents in every scenario you can, or basically to the extent you can challenge. And now I'm wondering what you think. I
Well,
could view it from two different ways. If I view it as like a benevolent thing, I could see the question like, hey, I think the let's say constitution is a bit vague in this. I want us to get more clarification on this. So let's try and pursue sort of more clarification in these cases. Now, a much more malevolent would be, I want to get this thing done. Do anything you can to basically pass this through. And
Well, of course, he can't
yeah,
do anything he wants to get it
yeah.
passed through. What he's saying is push the envelope, push the limits, see what test he's asking for a test. Every time a new president, this always happens, and there's nothing inherently wrong with this. The president sets the policy for the United States government, and the United States government takes a position. And again, when parties change, the position, the ideological position in terms of the law, changes from one president to another. Biden, for example, didn't like the death penalty. And so he just commuted most of the death penalty cases on the books in the federal government. It wasn't consistent. Even Biden wasn't consistent and principled about this because he left some people, like the 9/11 terrorists, on the hook for the death penalty. The Supreme Court has issued, 50 years ago, the Supreme Court declared death penalty unconstitutional. They reversed themselves. But since they reversed themselves and said the death penalty was okay, they've put a number of restrictions on it. People who are developmentally disabled, people who are minors, and on the kinds of execution, how the execution can be done, and the special aggravants that are required, not just any old homicide case. It has to be an aggravated first-degree murder, and what are those aggravants? And so it is a area of flux, and there's room to argue about. The United States government takes a position before the United States Supreme Court. The Solicitor General of the United States is the one who argues these kind of appellate cases before the Supreme Court, and that person works for the Attorney General. And if it's a matter of policy, so people talk about prosecutions, it would be wrong for a president to come in and say, prosecute person X. You see, we don't prosecute people, we prosecute crimes. And it would be unfair before you've even walked in the door to look at the evidence or gone through the legal process to finger one specific person. Now, if you're changing policy, and you're asking which direction should the United States government be asking the Supreme Court to go in terms of policy? How should the Solicitor General be arguing these cases before the Supreme Court? Well, the president has the right to set that kind of policy. And so if he's setting a law enforcement policy, a constitutional interpretive policy, it's perfectly okay. And I don't see, when I read the executive order here, I didn't see anything that was unconstitutional about it. He's just saying, fight it where you can, use the death penalty every time it looks like it's an arguable case, and let's push the boundaries so that we can get the Supreme Court to be more pro death penalty. On the face of it, whatever, I may agree or disagree with his opinion, but on the face of it, there's nothing unconstitutional about a president setting policy, legal policy for the Solicitor General, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's important to separate the two because, Constitution, I mean, the fact that we did amend it a couple of times, and I think few of those amendments were good. The fact is that it wasn't, in a sense, or maybe it was because of the bad interpretation that we even had to amend it. But basically, it's important to sort of separate, what we view as like the perfect system as objectivist and sort of what is, in a sense, according to the Constitution. Because sometimes we might, we might disagree with the actions Donald Trump take, but it's different if this is an unconstitutional action, and this is an unconstitutional actions that is maybe sort of good, such as maybe reversing the TikTok ban. In a sense, probably TikTok shouldn't have been banned in the first place, but sort of taking these steps is not the right way of going. It's sort of preserving the separation of powers is worth it, even if it means, sort of sometimes we lose on like specific
Absolutely. And that's the thing. We have to keep our eye on the principled ball here. Now, but on the other hand, there are things in our Constitution which an objectivist would just disagree with. And if the Supreme Court fairly interprets it, the income tax amendment, do I think the income tax is an evil, pernicious thing? Yeah. Well, but we have an amendment to the Constitution saying that Congress can impose an income tax. I don't like it, but it's not unconstitutional. Let me put it that way. And it didn't do us no good anyway to declare it unconstitutional if most people want it. As objectivists, we have to swallow sometimes the fact that there are some very non-rights respecting elements to the United States Constitution. And that's just the way it is. On the other hand, in any marginal case, if I were president, I would be issuing an order like Trump did on capital punishment, only on issues where I thought that there was we have a good case, such as restricting the power under the Commerce Clause, which has been stretched way out of proportion from anything the framers imagined, or the proper interpretation of privileges and immunities in the 14th Amendment, for example. I think there's all kinds of areas where the Supreme Court has gone way astray from the Constitution and what we objectivists would regard as justice and an individual rights oriented approach. So in all of those cases, a president certainly, an objectivist president, let me put it this way, should certainly be fighting for liberty and individual rights in every case he can. And President Jim would have an order to his Solicitor General: we fight Commerce Clause cases. We fight privileges and immunities cases because we are in favor of individual rights. Right.
We have a super chat from Bonnie. Thank you so much. Let's say, comment. Bonnie, who's been a member for 32 months, says 14th Amendment, all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. and subject to jurisdiction thereof are citizens. What are exceptions to the U.S. jurisdiction? So I think I wanted to bring it up, but you started talking about it anyway. So for people who want to know, you can just rewind back because we've covered it and we have to wrap up.
Let's say an ambassador to the
Yeah.
United States from Great Britain. His family is here and he lives here because, or in this case, she, the ambassador from the United Kingdom, is a she right now. Let's say she had children or adopted children here in the United States. The fact that they're born in the United States does not automatically make them citizens of the United States because of that other phrase, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Now, it seems to me that if a person has been here for a while and they just have a child, it does not matter the citizenship status. See, it's that case that I was talking about that's 127 years old now under the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Supreme Court found birthright citizenship because the parents were here as refugees, in effect, from China, and they had their child here. If the people who argue that it's just freed slaves that this is about are wrong on many levels. If the drafters of the 14th Amendment wanted it narrowly tailored like that, they could have just said that. The children of the people who were formerly slaves, who were born in the United States, they didn't. They said all persons and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That means, are you subject? You don't have diplomatic immunity, for example. And it could be that it's just that narrowly tailored. People who have diplomatic immunity or are here on temporary visas are not, quote, subject to the jurisdiction. They still owe their allegiance to some other foreign country. They're here for a specific legal and authorized purpose just to be here. Then their children are not citizens. That's basically it. And I hope that this case is upheld by the Supreme Court. I believe in myself in a wide degree of birthright citizenship. Now, if a person is just here, immediately they're in labor and they jump over the border and have a baby, I think there are borderline cases where you could say, okay, that person is not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. But I think for even illegal immigrants who've been here even a short period of time, I think their children born here are citizens of the United States because they were born here and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, at least under the 14th Amendment. And if anyone wants to change that, they're going to need a constitutional amendment, in my view.
Yeah, I think similar, because on the WhatsApp, we had a few discussions about this, and some people had certain problems with, or potential problems with the way it's right now. And you can have it, but it's still according to the Constitution. This is what it means. You can, again, if you want to change it, pass a amendment.
That's what you need to do, it seems to me.
Yeah, similar to when USA used to have the actual prohibition, and you could dislike it, but you couldn't say, well, let's just ignore it. Let's just ignore it. No, you have to pass an amendment to get rid of that because it was an amendment in the past also. So
if anyone's curious, it's the case of U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark from 1998, a United States Supreme Court case. I don't have the exact citation, but that'll be enough to get you there. United States versus Wong Kim, 1898.
We also have a super chat from Gail. Thank you so much. Another super chat from Gail. Thank you so much. And a super chat from Jonathan. Thank you so much. We barely covered anything. There's been much more.
You scratched the surface of the whole thing.
I think the general principle we got out there, which I think is the most important part about how to really think about it. Someone earlier mentioned that FDR had 600 executive orders and nobody cared. In actuality, I think he had about 4,000 of them, which is insane. Average for a president is about 160 from what I checked. So even with his 4 terms, it was still an insane amount.
It depends on
But
how you count it, but all of them have done hundreds. And it's since the 1950s, it's the possibility for many, many more have opened up as the powers of the executive branch have expanded. We have an unwieldy, very powerful executive branch with all of these alphabet agencies that have been granted all kinds of authority, in my mind, that's unconstitutional. But in all of these cases, the president has he's the one who is charged with taking care that the laws are faithfully executed. And whatever prosecutorial or executive discretion there is, it rests in the president. And insofar as there is any discretion granted to these agencies, the president theoretically can set policy that has the effect of law. And that is in my view, the unconstitutional thing that happened decades ago in slopping executive, legislative, and judicial powers all in one agency. That is a violation of the basic understanding of separation of powers that our country was founded on. Now, that's not going to change anytime soon. And so every time the White House changes parties, expect a new avalanche of executive orders to undo the executive orders of the other guy and to push the executive policy in a different direction. And that affects people's rights. That affects the policy of the United States. The de facto law of the United States gets changed like that with the stroke of, or to quote President Obama, with a phone or a pen. Astonishing, but true.
yeah, and I think while quantitative aspects of executive orders are problematic, the qualitative aspects might be much more
Much
devastating
more.
long term. It's important to remember when it comes to specifically FDR, when all gold was confiscated, it was done by executive order.
Right. And of course, we
So
haven't discussed the pardons, Biden's pardons or Trump's pardons. But Trump has been very busy, though. Even in comparison to previous presidents, Trump has hit the ground running for good or ill in a very, very energetic way with pardons, executive actions, executive orders, withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, excuse me, and so forth. And expect more. He's a very energetic president. He was at the Capital One Arena signing some of these, and then he came back to the White House to sign some, where he did an impromptu press conference while he was doing it. But he's been a very, very active and energetic president on this score, even by comparison to recent presidents.
yeah, I think I tried to check with Biden specifically, and I think it took him about until like middle of February until he had the amount of executive orders that like Trump did. Again, that doesn't, just the number of doesn't automatically make you much worse or something. It's a sort of like a sign of, the governing style we might see.
And how
But
powerful our president has become because Congress has so wrongly given these administrative agencies so much power, so much rulemaking authority that the president himself has become a super legislature unto himself. That's literally the situation that we're in the United States, one that our framers did not envision at all.
We'll be continuing on the reality show where we'll cover Israel's shocking October 7th failure revealed. There was some more stuff basically shown about what led to the failures of October 7th, and I think it's definitely interesting to check out. So make sure to watch the reality show in just a few minutes. Thank you, James, for joining me today. And just a reminder, if people are more interested in the way U.S. Constitution works, analyzing it and understanding it, you can become a YouTube Inner Circle member. There are a bunch of live streams we try to do every week, analyzing the U.S. Constitution, as well as if you are a website Rearden Metal member, you get access to all the recordings. I think there's more than a dozen sessions we already did. So sort of like really going through the Constitution, also going through the both history since and basically how it was either upheld or maybe corrupted or changed later on. So thank you everybody for watching. Thank you, James, for joining me today, and we'll see you on the reality show in just a minute or so. Thank you and bye bye.
Thank you. Okay.